Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, 100 years after his death. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, the poet's great-granddaughter. The month of December is an important one for commemorating Bharati. It is the month in which he was born. December 11th, his birthday, is celebrated in many places, including South India, as Bharati Day. Bharati himself was a great believer in marking anniversaries. He felt that they provide us with a perfect opportunity to remember the past, to celebrate the legacy of the important thinkers who have come before us, and to ensure the preservation of that legacy by incorporating it into our daily lives and carrying it forward into our future. Bharati Day 2021, which has just passed, marked the poet's 139th birthday. Of course, those who've been listening to the podcast for a while would already be well aware that 2021 was a landmark year for Bharati because it also marked 100 years since the poet's death in September of 1921. This is why it seemed most appropriate to give the title Bharati 100 to the podcast. This is an opportunity for us today to explore Bharati's writings, to hear his words from our perspectives, in the light of the world that we're currently living in, and the dilemmas, the conflicts, the challenges that we are facing today. I think that reading Bharati's works shows that he was a true visionary, in the sense that he was not only writing for the people of his day, but he was writing for the people of the future, us. And in many ways, his words and his thinking resonate even more, I think, with today's readers than they would have at the time at which he wrote them. He was so far ahead of his time. In that way, his words not only have relevance for us today, but I think they have power too. Interest in Bharati has been very high around his birthday this past year. No doubt, the arrival of the landmark 100 years since his death has also helped to stir people's memories of him and to make them aware of him once again. This past December, I was contacted by a large number of organizations as well as individuals located around the world who wanted to know more about Bharati, who were craving some knowledge of him. Not only did they want to know about his works, and notably about the English writings which have been republished in 2021, but they also wanted to know about his biography. They wanted to know about the legend that Bharati has become, and to find some ways to connect perhaps to the human being that he was. Talking about Bharati's life, entering into the exciting story of his life, is always a wonderful experience. People want to know not only the official stories, but they want to know the stories about his life from the family. They want to know what they can trust in terms of the information that is circulating about Bharati, and it's a legitimate concern because when a person becomes a legend, stories proliferate. Stories grow, and not all of them actually reflect the happenings in the person's life. They're not all truthful, those stories, even though many of them emerge out of a sense of love and attachment that people feel towards the poet. And in a sense, they seek to honor him with the creation of those stories. When Bharati wrote his own autobiography, which he never completed, he quoted some lines from a Tamil poet, Pudumai Pittan. The lines go as follows. Poyai, parankadayai, kanavai, mellaponadave. So the poet says, life becomes a lie, a legend, a dream, and slowly slips away. And dream, kanavu, was actually the title that Bharati gave to his autobiography. There is perhaps something inevitable about this process, the timeless process whereby a poet, a writer, becomes a legend through the evolution of his story over a century after his death. Nevertheless, it was very important to Bharati's family to maintain an accurate narrative of his life, just as important as it was to maintain, as far as possible, the accuracy of his words. This challenge was already keenly felt by Bharati's wife, my great-grandmother, Chellama Bharati. After the poet's death, she became concerned about the proliferation of stories regarding her husband and finally decided to combat that by writing his biography, which contained truthful facts that she knew about and had witnessed or been involved in herself. In her introduction to that work, she actually wrote that she was deeply concerned that the public should know the truth about her husband, and this is what motivated her to write. Incidentally, she didn't have the ability to write a book herself, so what she did was she dictated her book to her daughter, Thangamar Bharati, who wrote it down. This book was called Bharatiya Charitram, Bharati's biography, and it was subsequently republished in a new edition by her granddaughter, Vijaya Bharati, my own mother. With all this in mind, it seems highly appropriate to start 2022 with some episodes of the podcast dedicated to exploring Bharati's biography. First among these, I'm delighted to be able to present a discussion that I had on December 11th with a fascinating organization based in India called Storytrails. Storytrails was one of the organizations that contacted me to talk about Bharati's biography during his birth month, and I was greatly drawn to this particular group because of how they presented themselves. Reading from their website, they begin by pointing out India exists in her stories. And they explain their organization like this. They say Storytrails was born with the idea of experiencing India through her stories, of savoring the local sights and sounds, but through the eyes of a storyteller, of going beyond the sights themselves and uncovering characters and customs that make these places unique. Their focus, as I understand it, has been on travel in the past. Of course, we're in a difficult time for travel right now, but that hasn't by any means diminished the passion of the people that I got to meet at Storytrails. Their passion ultimately for stories about India. An impressive amount of preparation went into this program before it was actually broadcast live on December 11th. In fact, I had a long call over Skype with the team members when we discussed the research that they had done on Bharati's biography, which was extensive. It was all the more impressive to me because many of the team members had grown up in South India. They had grown up around the legend of Bharati and they knew him well in that sense. They had studied his poems in school and so on. But they wanted to confirm that what they knew about him and what they had discovered through their research was accurate. We were able to dismiss some aspects of the Bharati legend and to confirm others. Thanks to the wealth of information about the poet that my mother shared with me throughout her life, and due to the research that I was able to carry out while preparing the English writings for publication last year, I had some interesting knowledge and information at my fingertips that I was able to offer to supplement the knowledge gathered by the team. What follows now is an edited version of our discussion. Their interesting questions and their obvious passion for the subject matter were very inspiring to me. I hope you'll enjoy this audio version of our program, originally broadcast on Instagram on December 11th, 2021.
Hello, and welcome to this program. So, today we are going to speak about a poet who was a firebrand freedom fighter. Now, his words, they not only rallied the Indians, they rattled the British. Was he only a freedom fighter? No, he was a visionary. He had this image of an India where the women walked hand in hand with the men. He had this vision where there were no social divides of any kind, no caste, no class. A vision that holds good even today. We're talking about Subramania Bharati. Everyone knows his name, isn't it? So, like I was saying, he's just sung his way into all our hearts, into the hearts of everybody who can appreciate even a little bit of Tamil, whether it's because we all learnt his Papa Patil as children in school, heard this beautiful songs from films like Sindhu Nadi in Misai being an example, or at a later stage, heard classical singers very soulfully rendering the words that he wrote. Whatever be the reason, Subramania Bharati is a household name across Tamil Nadu. And today is his birth anniversary, a very special day. And so we have a very special person with us. We are delighted from Storytrails to be in conversation with Subramania Bharati's great granddaughter, Meera T. Sundararajan. Now, Meera is an eminent personality in her own right. She's an expert on copyright law, and she's a passionate advocate for authors' rights across continents. She wears many hats. She's a professor at Oxford University. She's a prolific writer. She's a noted pianist. And as a Canadian citizen, she's well versed both in English and in French. Best of all, she is very passionate about continuing this legacy that her great grandfather left behind and spreading his sentiments far and wide. So, welcome, Meera. We are delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you as well.
So, let me start off by setting a context. We're going to have a very interesting conversation with Meera. But before we do that, unless there is a context, we're not going to understand where we are coming from. So, I'll have to tell you a little bit about the time that he lived in and about this eminent personality himself. Now, Bharati was born on the 11th of December in 1882. His mother died very young, and he was raised by his father. Now, his father used to constantly take him to the court. He was born in this village called Etayapuram, and the court of Etayapuram seemed to have been very passionate about promoting arts and crafts of various kinds. So, poets, scholars, dramatists, authors, they all used to come to the court. Very early exposure to such wonderful arts that lit that spark within him because it really took root and it blazed. Bharati is not his name. It was a title that was given to him by the king of Etayapuram, the Raja of Etayapuram, to recognize his abilities with words. So Bharati literally means the one blessed by Saraswati. He couldn't get a better name, don't you think? And as was the norm in those days, at a very young age, Bharati was only 15 when he got married to his even younger wife, the 7-year-old Chellamma. Meera, I just can't help but ask you this. Chellamma was his muse. She was his rock. She was his inspiration in every way. And yet, Bharati wrote songs to Kannamma. Who is Kannamma?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So, Kannamma, we know Bharati was a great devotee of Kannan, and he wrote one of his most famous poem cycles about Karnan called Karnan Pattu. And I think a clue to the identity of Karnama is in the Karnan Pattu, because what he does, as many readers would already know, many listeners today would already know, in the Karnan Pattu is he visualizes God or the divine in ordinary human relationships. So the God as the mother, God as the servant, God as the friend, as the beloved. And when he talks about the beloved in Karnan Pattu, then he talks about Karnama. And I think that's an important clue. So for him, Karnama is the divine female or the divine feminine. And he talks about her in so many contexts, including many very passionate poems, poems that are divine poems that are about divine love. There is some confusion about Karnama and Chelama, and that's actually not the fault of today's readers, but it goes back in the history, because Bharati did write about Karnama, but he also wrote poems about Chelama. And in those poems, he named Chelama his wife. Chelama Pudunahe Rojapu is one of those poems. And what happened after Bharati died and his poems were being published, Chelama was actually the first publisher after Bharati's death. She brought out one volume of his poems in 1921. She did some more publishing, but then she passed on that endeavor to Bharati's half-brother, Vishwanatha. And when he was publishing, the family then became concerned that maybe it wasn't totally proper, totally respectable for such passionate poems to be addressed to Chelama by name. So they changed the name. He changed the name from Chelama to Karnama. And this is something that was very upsetting, actually, to my mother, who was a great Bharati scholar, because she felt that Chelama's right was taken away from her. Those poems were changed because they were dedicated to her. They were her property in a very spiritual sense of the term. So my mother has published a new edition of Bharati's poems. I'll show you that book in a moment, in 4 volumes. And in that new edition, she has restored the name Chelama to those poems. So now Chelama is back in her rightful place as the dedicatee of those poems. So there is both a Karnama and a Chelama in Bharati's poetry.
How wonderful, how absolutely wonderful, and how ahead of his time, isn't it? To write such passionate verses to his wife, when at a time when women didn't even walk alongside their men, but a good step behind, if at all they walked with them.
Well,
So
that
that
interesting point that you bring up there too, and I'll just make a little comment about that, because it's true. I mean, no one can deny Bharati had the most progressive ideas when it came to women. But there's something interesting about those ideas, because he felt that those ideas were deeply rooted in the Indian culture. And he wasn't getting those ideas from how the British were treating women or the French. In fact, in a lot of ways, those women were even behind in terms of their legal status in their respective countries at those times. A lot of people don't know that. As a legal scholar, I can tell you that with some authority. But Bharatiya, he actually studied the culture going back, and he said, looking back at the Vedas, there were even women poets who were writing, women seers who were writing Vedic poems. And that's how highly qualified and how high the status of Indian women has been in the past. And then, of course, there's the evidence of the worship of Shakti, the mother principle, female principle. And Bharati himself was a Shakta, total dedicatee of Shakti and Parashakti. It's God. So he was drawing upon those traditions when he gave the status to women. He felt that that was a truly Indian thing, to recognize not only the equality, but even the leadership capacity of women. And he said they should be the one. They're actually above the men in the hierarchy, is what he said. He was
That's lovely. Not hand in hand, but one step ahead.
One step ahead. And he said women are the keepers of civilization. Where woman comes art. Those are his actual words. And he said they are the ones who should be leading the society, who should write the laws. And it's an interesting tradition that he is drawing. And of course, sorry, just to go back to your point there about the passionate nature of his poems, there's a long tradition in Tamil poetry as well of dedication to the female principle, where they talk in a very open way about all of these aspects of life. And so Bharati was firmly backed up by his literary predecessors when he ventured into the
Wonderful, wonderful. That is so interesting to hear. But to come back to our story, I remember you mentioning that Bharati's father died of a broken heart. He seems to have died almost after the marriage was over, and Bharati immediately left and went off to Banaras, to Varanasi. Can you share that story with us, Meera?
Yes, of course. So Bharati's father was a very interesting character in his own right. And he was a very entrepreneurial man. There were many men and women in South India at that time who were entrepreneurial and tried different things in spite of the British effort to suppress their activities. He tried to create a cotton in South India. And of course, as we know, the whole arena of cloth was a great battlefield economic between the Indians and the British. And the British drove him out of business. And Bharati writes about that, and he says, yeah, the loss of that business and the loss of the wealth associated with it, it was a devastating thing for his father and actually ended up bringing about his death. It's a terribly sad story.
Right.
Yeah, and then after that, Bharati himself fell into quite a depression. My mother has written about this, and he needed a change. And at that time, the invitation came from his relatives who were staying in Benares to go there and spend some time in Varanasi. So he went, and he was totally transformed by that experience. He fell in love with the city of Benares, and he was just intoxicated by the spiritual environment and all the languages and everything that he was exposed to there. And then he adopted his dress. So the iconic image of Bharati that we all know, with his turban, with his beautiful mustache, and his jacket, this was the appearance that he took on when he first went to Benares. And in fact, the family that he was staying with were a bit scandalized because, here's our South Indian gentleman. Suddenly he's wearing this unusual sort of outfit, North Indian getup, and what's become of him? But in fact, he had been infected with a passion for Indian culture, pan-Indian culture, and for the national movement. And this was the uniform that took him, in fact, right until his death.
Beautiful. So he's had his name, he's got his physical appearance and characteristics. So Bharati just had to build on that and go forward, isn't it? When
Yes.
he came back to the South, he was a little lost with regard to jobs. He tried his hand at various things, including teaching a bunch of school children. But around 1904, this interest in journalism seems to have bitten him, and he took up his job as a sub-editor for a Tamil journal called Swadeshamitran. And this was the time when the freedom movement was picking up momentum. It was impacting people's lives. And journalism was a very important tool for the Indian National Congress. So Bharati was by now an ardent supporter of the freedom movement, and he found himself writing passionately about issues that were close to the hearts of the Indians, issues that worried them, that needed that had to be pushed and rallied into. And Bharati did that very, very well. So he started writing and publishing in many papers across South India, and they were all happy to print what he had written because he wrote so well. Everything was grist to his mill at that point in time. He wrote about so many things. He wrote hymns to gods and goddesses. He wrote nationalistic pieces and articles inciting people against the British, uniting the people. He wrote about women's emancipation. He wrote about nature. He even wrote about the Russian Revolution. So Bharati was very busy writing at that time. He wrote so much about as I see, literally every topic under the sun. Would you like to share something about the diversity of his work at this point?
Yes, I'd love
to give our listeners, yeah.
And in fact, journalism was totally a fit. It was a hand fitting a glove there. So it's such a natural fit for Bharati. He was one writer. I mean, I think there are so many writers who've had their training, in a sense, in the world of journalism. I mean, even here in the West, if you look at, Ernest Hemingway, he was working for the Toronto Star. Morley Callahan, great Canadian writer, got his training as a journalist. I mean, the numbers are just countless. And so Bharati was in that very fine training ground, proven training ground for excellent writers. And he was such a free spirit, as you explained. He was curious about every subject under the sun, which I think is really the hallmark of an outstanding intellectual. There was nothing he couldn't understand and develop an opinion about. He was a very opinionated young man. And so he wrote journalism, he wrote letters, and he did it both in Tamil and in English extensively throughout all the publications in South India. There's no topic that he didn't cover. In fact, I can even say about the national movement and so on, he wrote about all of the personalities. He knew them all through his activities as part of the Congress Party. He was actually part of the extremist wing. And so he traveled to the meetings and so on and wrote poems as well as articles about all of the figures that he met. Tilak, Gokhale, eventually about Gandhi as well. So nothing that he didn't cover. And he also enjoyed functioning in multiple languages. He was a true polyglot. So he wrote not only in Tamil, but extensively in English, in Sanskrit. He knew Hindi and French as well. In French, it's very interesting because when he eventually went to Pondicherry to live, as you were about to narrate, he adopted the French revolutionary motto for his magazine. So the motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, was the motto that he took for his own magazine, Liberty, Equality, Brotherhood. Nothing could have been more fitting for Bharati than that particular motto.
True. So you have written a book about him very recently. I'd like to share it to our...
I'd love to show it to you because it has this beautiful cover, which is showing the parrots as a symbol of Indian culture, as well as the, Bharati wrote a lot about birds, including not only the quail partu, but also the cockeye parliament. He imagines the crows sitting in a parliament like in Westminster discussing the future of the country and so on. So it's a good symbol for the book. And what this book is actually a new edition of just what I've been talking about, Bharatiyar's original writings in the English language. And as you can see, it's quite a substantial book. He wrote a lot in English. And in this, we have collected, as far as possible, everything major that he wrote in English. So pieces about the national movement, a wonderful piece and very disturbing piece where he talks in detail about the activities of the British in South India and in Madras province, which was so central to holding on to their power, their government in India. He gives an eyewitness account of all that they did to maneuver things in their favor, and does not make for a very pretty reading. It is brutal story.
Hard-hitting.
Exactly. And how, what's most disturbing about it, not only the violence that they use, but the measures that they use to suppress free speech. And I think this is the key to why today the world doesn't know as much as they should about our great heroes, Subramania Bharati being foremost among those in South India. It's because of a very conscious policy by the British to suppress these writings and suppress these voices. And so the mission of this book is to fight that post-colonial legacy and to say, no, the voices of our culture, the leaders, they must be allowed to come out now, and whatever they said must be heard by everyone around the world so that they can know how far ahead of their time these people were, and frankly, how great the culture is that they represent. And
that's right. What you said was very, very right. Suppressing those voices is almost impossible.
Yes.
But it didn't stop the British from trying, did it? They were not at all happy with what Bharati was doing because this very gutsy man was literally doing it under their noses. He was living in Madras, which was the capital of the British at that time. And he was doing all this work against the British. And it was like as if the people were totally with him because they would take his songs, set them to music, and sing them. And they got so inflamed by all those songs. So all this made the British more and more angry. And slowly, all Bharati's friends started getting arrested. And Bharati could literally see that noose tightening around him. So soon the time came when he had to flee from Madras and go away. And like Meera just told you, he chose to go to Pondicherry. But why did he choose Pondicherry? Because at that time, Pondicherry was ruled by the French. And the British and the French, well, you know the relationship, isn't it? It isn't a very happy one at the best of times. And at that time, at least, an enemy of the British was a friend of the French. There was no doubt about it. So Bharati was actually welcomed into Pondicherry, and he went there and settled down. So, do you think he stopped all his revolutionary work just because he left his home ground and went away? Not a chance. He continued living in Pondicherry. He continued reading, writing, editing, composing, and inciting people. So he quickly set about publishing this magazine called India, a very revolutionary magazine which got printed from Pondicherry. And apparently, it used to be bundled up in hay and smuggled across the borders and into Madras. So it was an exciting life he lived, I must say, in those days. So this freedom movement, so much of his emotional writing was what drove the people of Tamil Nadu on. Mira, you know what I'm going to ask you now. You just have to sing one song for us, one of those patriotic songs of Bharati.
Well, I'm going to do something better, I think, than singing it for you. I'm actually going to play you a little recording here, which is going to be of Bharati's family. So a whole group of people is going to be heard in this recording, including his granddaughter and grandson, and a number of other people as well. So let me just, I hope our techniques are going to allow us to do this, but I think that they will. Okay, I'll play a few moments. You signal to me when you'd like me to stop. Okay?
Sure.
All right.
பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே, ஜய 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 பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே. 30 கோடி ஜனங்களின் சங்கம் முழுமைக்கும் பொது உடைமை, 30 கோடி ஜனங்களின் சங்கம் முழுமைக்கும் பொது உடைமை. ஒப்பில்லாத சமுதாயம் உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை, இந்த உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை, இந்த உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை. பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே, ஜய 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 பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே. மனிதர் உணவை மனிதர் பறிக்கும் வழக்கம் இனியுண்டோ, மனிதர் உணவை மனிதர் பறிக்கும் வழக்கம் இனியுண்டோ. மனிதர் நோக மனிதர் பார்க்கும் வாழ்க்கை இனியுண்டோ, புலனில் வாழ்க்கை இனியுண்டோ, நம்மில் அந்த வாழ்க்கை இனியுண்டோ. பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே, ஜய 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 பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே.
Wow. Mira, that's what's called a goosebumps racing moment, really. Imagine his own family singing the song he composed and which all of South India sings now. Awesome. Awesome. Pity that the British...
Something there as well, if I may, because I think it's not so well known, to my own surprise actually, that Mahakavi Bharati was a very talented musician and composer as well as being a poet. And so for most of his songs, he sang them himself. And there's a way of singing that he developed for his own songs. And what he did, he founded an oral tradition in the family where as soon as he composed a song, he would go and teach it to his wife, Chalama, and to his 2 daughters. So he had Tangamar, my grandmother, was the elder daughter. Shakuntala was the younger daughter. She was still very young even when her father died. But all 3 of them learned the songs. And then Chalama and Tangamar, I know from my personal knowledge, were very, very good singers. They taught their grandchildren. And then we have learned, so I have learned to sing from my mother a number of the songs. But these are Bharati's own way of singing the songs. So it's different mostly. Some of them are similar, but I think most of them are different than what you hear Carnatic musicians or, of course, film songs singing. Sometimes they take the same raga and recompose it. But I love Bharati's original compositions, and my mother loved them too. We feel that his talent shows in a special way through the way he deals with melodies and rhythms and so on. It's very beautiful. It's scintillating. And so my
Can
mother...
we hear a piece?
Well, we just heard one example.
Oh, that's the one. Oh, okay.
Play one more. I have one more for you just ready here as well. It's a little bit of change of pace, though. It's not a national song. It is a Kannama song. And here's another example of the style of singing in the family, inherited from Bharatiyar himself. This is called Chuttumuri Shudarthan.
சுட்டுவிழி சுடர்தான் கண்ணம்மா சூரிய சந்திரரோ, கண்ணம்மா சுட்டுவிழி சுடர்தான் கண்ணம்மா சூரிய சந்திரரோ. வட்டக்கரிய விழி கண்ணம்மா வட்டக்கரிய விழி கண்ணம்மா வட்டக்கரிய விழி கண்ணம்மா வான கருமை கொல்லோ பட்டுக்கரு நீல புடவை கண்ணம்மா பட்டுக்கரு நீல புடவை கண்ணம்மா பட்டுக்கரு நீல புடவை பதித்தனல் வயிறம் நட்ட நடு நிசியோ தெரியும் நட்சத்திரங்களடி கண்ணம்மா சோலை மலர் ஒளியோ உனது சுந்தர புன்னகைதான் கண்ணம்மா சோலை மலர் ஒளியோ உனது சுந்தர புன்னகைதான்.
Beautiful. Truly beautiful. How it must have been to have been Chellamma in those days. All of South India was singing her name.
Yes.
But then,
This was my mother singing, so Bharati's granddaughter.
granddaughter. Lovely. So obviously there was one group who did not like the song, and that was the British. So they tried their level best to control him. They stopped any money reaching him from Madras. They banned his newspapers in their territories. Not that any of those things were going to stop this very indomitable man. So he continued with his writing. And it was in Pondicherry, to be very honest, that his best works were composed. That's where he could meet with a whole lot of other revolutionaries who were also finding refuge in Pondicherry. And he dabbled in so many things, apparently, in Pondicherry. He wanted to learn French. And I'm fascinated by the fact that he even wanted to learn sword fighting. So this was a man who was ready to try his hand at anything, I'm guessing. But what was life like for him in Pondicherry, Bira?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, because he was so involved in the politics and the national movement in British India. And then, as you explained so beautifully, he had to leave. And suddenly he sort of fell into a vacuum in Pondicherry because he was, the national movement. And that was difficult for him. He was so passionate about the cause of the Indian freedom. But at the same time, he got something invaluable in Pondicherry. With the benefit of historical hindsight, he got time to write. And I think that was even, just as important as the fact that he made friends with other nationalists and so on. He had a lot of time on his hands. And I think it's to his credit that he was able to use that time so creatively, not worry about the hardships that he was going through, not let that take over completely. He remained a creative man, totally connected to the source of poetry. And for that, he wrote a number of masterpieces while he was in Pondicherry. All those long poems, Pattu Panchale Sabadam, that he's well known for, he wrote them in Pondicherry. And my mother used to say, because she's an expert on Bharati's biography, she used to say, had he not gone to Pondicherry, probably he couldn't have done that substantial writing because he didn't have time. He was involved in the national movement.
National movement. Right. So Pondicherry did wonderful things for him in terms of literary creativity. But at home, things must have been very difficult, isn't it? By now, the 2 baby girls were born. There was no money coming in. Bharati's works could not be published anywhere else. Chellamma must have had a particularly trying time, I'm guessing, going through all this. How did she deal with it?
It was a very challenging time. And I think Chellamma really showed her mettle in those days. There are a lot of ideas about Chellamma in India, partly because there was a movie made by Bharati back in the 80s, which a lot of people have seen, and that portrayed her as a very sort of typical housewife. So, although I hate to put forward a stereotype like that, there is no typical housewife. But anyway, for lack of a better way of putting it, they portrayed her as somebody who wasn't really participating in his efforts and didn't understand what he was doing or what the national movement was about, and was sort of fighting him on the home front. And this is a very bitter thing for the family. You know, my mother, who was brought up by her grandmother, she's very upset by this portrayal of Chelama, and spent a lot of time in later years writing about her grandmother, trying to rectify it, because that was not who Chelama was. Chelama was the Pudumai Peng, the new kind of woman that Bharati saw with his own eyes. Bharati Kanda Pudumai Peng. My parents refer to her that way, because she was married to the poet when she was 7, like you pointed out. She got all her education from him, and she figured out very quickly that her husband was a very special man. And she took his poetry to heart. She was totally dedicated to it. And whatever he was doing for the national movement, she was supposed to be his partner in those efforts. He considered her that. In fact, one day they were talking, he was going to go out and lead a procession. And she was worried, that her husband might be killed. And he said, "Don't you worry at all. If something happens to me, you know what you have to do. You come, you take the banner from my hand, you carry it, and you lead the procession." And that's how he kept her in his life, and how she became the partner of Bharati in everything that he was doing. So he wrote about her. He said that she was his Kavidai Talaivi, so the chief of his poetry, and that she had made his life a heaven. Imagine when he was going through all these practical difficulties. So, she managed the difficulties of the household, and she understood that it was the duty of the family to put up with these things because there was a higher goal that they were working towards. And she brought up her daughters the same. So that spirit of sacrifice has been very much alive amongst Bharati's wife, children, and so on, throughout these years.
Right. So there's this interesting story about Bharati not having enough money to pay the doctor for his child's illness. Can you tell us that?
Yeah, there are a number of situations where Bharati came up short of money. And so often what would happen, for example, his landlord in Pondicherry would come expecting to collect the rent. And he would sit down and Bharati would sing a song, and he would just get up and leave. And he had heard Bharati's song, and that was enough for him. So people that really supported the poet. I'll say one more thing about that too, because Bharati had inherited that entrepreneurial spirit of his father. He actually wanted to circumvent these problems with his finances by publishing an edition of his own works. And he wrote a brilliant letter in English, actually, which he circulated to a number of people that he knew, suggesting to them that they could contribute money for the publication of his books, and explaining how he wanted to do it. He said he wanted to publish American-style books with excellent bindings and new paper. That's his own wording. And so he had a beautiful plan for publishing, but unfortunately no one would loan him. No one would invest in him. Hey, there are startups everywhere raising money, and he was near in that regard too.
I know. He could convince his landlord, but he couldn't convince other people to pool in for enough money for him. This is such a pity. Yeah. But he did come back to Madras, isn't it? After 10 years in Pondicherry, he did return to Madras. The British really. So what happened? Why did he come back?
Yeah, I think he came back because it became too difficult for him to be away from the national movement. That was the purpose of his life at a certain level. And he felt that he had to come back and participate in what was happening. He couldn't live in exile anymore. So he came out of Pondicherry, and promptly he got arrested. And
Cuddalore.
Yeah, put in jail in Cuddalore for 2 months. But his friends gathered together and got him out. And then when he was released, he went from there to Kadayam, which was Chalama's village. And he had some interesting experiences in Kadayam. Shall I go ahead and talk about that?
Please, wherever Bharati goes, there are interesting experiences. So please go ahead.
Very interesting experiences. So Kadayam is a beautiful village where Chalama's family was from. It's a mountainous place, and there's a beautiful temple there. So Bharati was very enjoying the environment and enjoying the spiritual environment there, the nature and so on. But he was very passionate about equality, as we've been talking about, not only for women, but for everybody. That's typical, inclusive. And he would
Exactly.
think through a proposition. If women are equal, so is everybody else. If a wife is equal at home, she's also equal outside. He would think about everything in detail. So in this case, he became involved in speaking about caste equality, which was another long-standing passion of Bharati, just actually totally ingrained in him. He couldn't think in it. All human beings are equal for him. So caste inequality had no place in Indian society or anywhere. He was involved in having a number of followers, Sishyangar, so disciples, all different castes. He would eat with them. And then he had a disciple named Kanagalingam, for whom he did that Brahmin sacred thread ceremony. The Punal ceremony, sacred thread, he instituted that for his disciple Kanagalingam, who then wrote a book about that, actually. But these behaviors ended up really antagonizing the Brahmin community in that village. And so they sent him out of the village. They sent him out of that section, the Brahmin section. And he had to go and live on the outskirts of town, separated from his family and so on. So it became an untenable situation. And eventually what they did was the family united and left Kadayam.
Came back to.
And that was the place where he was meant to be. And of course, where the final moments eventually came.
Yes, and that was pretty sad in itself, isn't it? An amazing man with a tragically short life. That's Bharatiyar. What were his last days like in Chennai?
Well, he came back to Chennai, and I think that his health was already pretty compromised, by all the hardships he'd been through, the stress. He was a very sensitive man. And then he had this period in jail and so on. So he was in good shape. And he had a temple that he liked to go to in Tiruvallikirni.
The Parthasarathi.
The Parthasarathi temple, exactly, where there was an elephant who was his friend. And one day when he went there, he used to go and give food and so on to the elephant. And one day when he went there, the elephant was not well. And they told him, no, stay away, don't approach the elephant today. But he wouldn't listen. The elephant was his friend. So he went and approached the elephant, and the elephant knocked him down. And then he fell between the four legs of the elephant. My mother has described all this, actually. So he fell. The elephant came to a stop. He didn't move. And his came and retrieved him from between the feet of the elephant and took him back home. And a few days after that incident, he actually died. So I know the common story is that the accident with the elephant caused his death. Definitely it was a precipitating factor, but I don't think that he was well. Apparently he was suffering from dysentery. The infection was involved. So he was in poor shape. In his final moments, it's quite amazing. He came to know that he was going to die. And so what he did, he got up from his sick bed and he dressed fully, put on his jacket, his turban, everything, lay down, and then passed away.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And thus ended the life of a poet who resonates more with us now than it did then, obviously, because apparently at his funeral, there were barely a handful of people. It was a very small funeral, very unheard of funeral in many places. But that was...
Yes, I think that's right. The comparing him to other writers in other countries, someone like Dostoevsky, who occupies such an important place for Russians. There were thousands of people. His funeral was a great state event and so on. But this was not the situation in India in Bharati's time in South India. So there were a few people at the funeral. And then I would just say that as a poet, his physical incarnation ended then. Because we have to have some spiritual belief. Otherwise, how can we go on, and face these things? It's simply too painful. But his words are alive and well. In fact, they interest people, as you said, more than ever before, 100 years after his physical body is no more. So in that sense, he's alive. He's traveling all over the world now. His words.
True.
His ideas are influencing people, Indians, Tamil, people of all countries, cultures, races, religions, are finding out about him. So my hope is his immortality is only starting. We've seen the first century. There should be another 100 years. The whole world is going to know about Bharati. And for us, as people of Tamil origin, it's going to be a matter of great pride when people learn about
Right.
him. It's going to be.
Of course. That's a big, big legacy that you're carrying, Meera. And since you're writing so much about him and talking so much about him and singing so much about him, I'm sure you're doing a great job of keeping his memory alive. But before we close, can we have one song from you, please?
I'm sorry. I'm actually going to have to refuse that request because I've not been well the past day, and I can't do justice to Bharati's songs with the throat. Please
Bad throat.
But
okay, no.
That just means that you'll be kind enough to invite me on another day, and I can share it with you then. I'll be
a song with you. We will definitely take you up on that promise. But that is Bharati for you all, for all those who have been hearing. So what was his greatest achievement? Probably it was bringing that spirit in a language that was so simple that even the communist man could understand and participate in what India itself was going through in those days. And the fact that he was successful is measured by the idea that till today, like Meera rightly said, Bharati resonates with every one of us. Even today, his songs stir that something inside you that make you stand up a little straighter and take a little more pride in this country that is ours. And it's so wonderful that 4 generations later, Meera is the ambassador of this very rich tradition. So, Meera, it was a complete pleasure talking to you. And all of us at Storytrails, we wish you great success in propagating Bharati's ideals. Keep singing. We'll meet you again definitely and have more programs with you. Thank you so much for being a part of this program today.
Thank you so much. And I'll say one word, if I may. We often talk about Bharati as Mahakavi. And I think that your words point towards understanding why we call him Mahakavi, because what he did in his poetry and in all of his writings is he brought dignity to the life of ordinary Indians and ultimately ordinary people, whether or anywhere in the world. So he gave a voice to people who didn't have a voice. And that's why I have seen people falling at the feet of his descendants. That's why we venerate someone like Bharati, because he lifted us up. And it's something truly extraordinary.
Truly. Thank you so much, Meera. Been such a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy Bharati Day.